The U.S. Supreme Court appears ready to allow Tennessee's ban on transgender health care for children after hearing today's oral arguments in the highly anticipated case U.S. versus Skrmetti. Tennessee's law bans puberty blockers and hormone therapy for transgender minors and imposes civil penalties against physicians who violate the law. CNN's Paula Reed breaks down the conservative justice's skepticism on the challenge to Tennessee's law.
If you change the individual's sex, it changes the result. And a law like that can't stand on bare rationality.
That's Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar arguing Tennessee's ban on medical care for transgender minors amounts to sex discrimination, which is unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause.
Fight back!
But Tennessee argued their law protects minors from irreparable harm.
Its application turns entirely on medical purpose, not a patient's sex. That is not sex discrimination. The Equal Protection Clause does not require the states to blind themselves to medical reality.
Conservative justices, like Samuel Alito, focused in on how other countries, such as the United Kingdom and Sweden, have recently shifted policies to limit access to treatments for transgender youth.
I wonder if you would like to stand by the statement that you made in your petition, or if you think it would now be appropriate to modify that and withdraw the statement that there is overwhelming evidence establishing that these treatments have benefits that greatly outweigh the risks and the dangers.
If the court wants to go ahead and look at what's happening in Europe, the UK has not categorically banned this care. Sweden, Finland, and Norway, the other jurisdictions that my friends point to, have not banned this care. And I think that's because of the recognition that this care can provide critical, sometimes life-saving benefits for individuals with severe gender dysphoria.
But liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor highlighting potential harm of withholding treatment.
Some children suffer incredibly with gender dysphoria, don't they?
Yes, it's a very serious medical condition.
Some attempt suicide?
Yes, the rates of suicide are striking, and it's a vulnerable population.
And both sides closely watching Chief Justice John Roberts, a potential swing vote, as he suggested the court should leave questions of medical nuance to the states.
Doesn't that make a stronger case for us to leave those determinations to the legislative bodies rather than try to determine them for ourselves?
That line of questioning concerning Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson.
I'm worried that we're undermining the foundations of some of our bedrock equal protection cases.
ACLU attorney Chase Strangio sharing those concerns as he made history as the first known openly transgender person to argue before the Supreme Court.
Tennessee claims this sex-based line drawing is justified to protect children. But SB 1 has taken away the only treatment that relieved years of suffering for each of the adolescent plaintiffs.
The incoming Trump administration is expected to reverse federal support for transgender care for minors, which means the justices could just dismiss this case. But there is another appeal out there asking the court to consider this issue a different way and asking whether parents should have the right to make medical decisions for their children. Look, that's an issue that has divided conservatives, and today both sides of this case agreed. That is a question that the court could still consider no matter what they do with this case. Jake?
All right, Paula Reed, thanks so much. Let's bring in Tennessee Attorney General John Skrmetti, who is the respondent in this case, defending the state ban. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. So you were at the court today. What was your sense on how the justices heard Tennessee's argument? Do you agree with the observers who say that the majority seemed largely sympathetic to the Tennessee's point of view?
Well, you never want to prognosticate, Jake, but certainly they were asking a lot of probing questions. This is the first constitutional case looking at gender identity issues. And I think the court recognizes that this will have a potentially significant precedential effect. So they were really pressing both sides. It was a long argument, and they worked through quite a few issues.
Here's a basic question for you. So what do you say to the parents of a transgender minor who say, you are taking away the only thing that is keeping my kid from killing himself or herself? That your ban, your imposition of your view is going to result in my kid taking his life. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, suicide is very serious, and it's a huge concern, and there's been a lot of rhetoric around that. But today at the court, Chase Strangio, the ACLU's attorney, conceded that transition treatments for children do not change the rate of completed suicide. And so we hear a lot of rhetoric about how this is the only solution to kids killing themselves, which I think is very dangerous. Nobody wants kids to do that. But the actual scientific evidence of research into it shows that it really doesn't make a difference in the rate of suicide, whether a child is treated or not.
During arguments, the U.S. Solicitor General warned if the U.S. Supreme Court upholds Tennessee's law, it will lead to a nationwide ban. This will not just affect Tennessee, as you yourself have already acknowledged. Take a listen.
I think it's important to recognize that my friend's arguments would equally apply to a nationwide ban if this were enacted by Congress. And so I think that the court should keep that in mind when thinking about the level of scrutiny here.
Is that the goal here, or do you think that California should be able to do whatever California wants to do?
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of our federal system is we have 50 states. The people of each state govern themselves, and they're able to make their own decisions. Now, in Tennessee, we tend to think California is wrong about a lot of things, but they're free to be wrong. They are able to do that. I think a federal ban is a much different issue. There are other constitutional issues involved in that, limits on the federal power. This is all about the state's ability to make its decisions for itself.
The law, I have to say, I understand when people who oppose the law say, this is an anti-liberty move. You are taking away the ability of parents to make decisions with their kid and the healthcare provider about the treatment that family wants. How do you respond to that?
Well, if you look at the systematic reviews of research, every one of them shows little to no benefit for kids from these procedures.
Right, but who gets to determine that? You're not trying to ban nose jobs. You're not trying to ban breast augmentation or breast reduction, for that matter. You're only talking about this one issue.
Well, I mean, I think the state, when the legislature looked at this, they did an intense review of the research. They talked to experts. And each state gets to make its own evaluation when regulating the practice of medicine of how to balance risks and benefits and how to balance the trade-offs therein. And here, there is a real risk to kids. There are lifelong potential side effects: permanent loss of fertility, permanent loss of sexual function, tumors, blood clots, bone density disorders, cognitive impairment. So it's not as if you either let them do it or you don't, and that's the only choice. There are major downstream effects on kids, and we regulate the practice of medicine all the time. That's what states have done for hundreds of years.
Do you think that's what this is? You don't think that there's a religious component to this? Is your faith or the faith of the legislators in Tennessee, is that part of this at all? Is that guiding them at all or guiding you?
I mean, I can't speak to what drives each legislator to make their decisions, but you see the coalition involved in this, and there were a number of LGB groups involved. There were a number of medical groups involved in this. The decision was based on the research. And if you look at what's going on in Europe, those are countries that are very different than Tennessee or Texas or the various red states here. They have very different commitments, very different values, but they've reached the same result through an evidence-based approach.
But they're not banning it, is the difference. I mean, they might be less inclined to think it's the greatest thing in the world, but they're not saying you can't do it.
There are pretty severe restrictions on the availability of these procedures for kids. Some of them allow experimental procedures. Some have age limits that are under 18, but 16 years old. And in the red states, there are different variations on exactly what the prohibitions look like. But the gist of it is an understanding that there is a huge downside for kids and that the state's job is to protect them in an area of unsettled science, especially where the numbers have gone up so quickly for reasons that we don't understand. You want to make sure that kids aren't making lifelong sacrifices when the evidence doesn't show a benefit to them from these procedures.
Tennessee Attorney General John Skrmetti, thank you so much for being here, taking our questions. We really appreciate it.